Imagine the set of a major network television production. It is a world of controlled chaos, cables snaking across the floor, the hum of generators, and the intense, flickering light of a soundstage in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In this world, the director is more than just a boss. They are a godlike figure who controls the reality of everyone in the room. For two young twin brothers, 10 and 11 years old, this was the backdrop of their childhood. They were stars on the Fox series The Cleaning Lady, and their mentor was a man the world had known for decades. Timothy Busfield wasn't just a guest. He was the executive producer and the director. He was the veteran hand guiding their young careers. But as the cameras stopped rolling between 2022 and 2025, a shadow began to fall over the playful environment he claimed to create. A shadow that would eventually lead to a 2,000-mile flight from justice and a criminal indictment that threatened to dismantle a 40-year legacy. This isn't just a story about a fall from grace. It is a story about the terrifying power of a title, the slow process of grooming, and the moment two children decided that Uncle Tim was a name they never wanted to hear again. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The professional relationship began with the promise of stardom. The twins were cast in a recurring capacity, a role that required them to spend hundreds of hours in close proximity to the production's leadership. In the entertainment industry, child actors are protected by a strict set of labor laws and Coogan accounts, but the psychological boundary is often much harder to police. Timothy Busfield, an Emmy winner known for 30-something and The West Wing, occupied a position of extreme trust. He was a father figure in the industry, someone who had worked with children since his own early days in the 1980s. According to the arrest affidavit later filed by the Albuquerque Police Department, Busfield began to blur the lines of professional conduct almost immediately. He didn't just direct the boys. He integrated himself into their emotional lives. The title Uncle Tim was not an accidental nickname. Investigators described this as a cornerstone of social grooming, a tactic used to establish a false sense of familial security. By insisting the boys call him Uncle, Busfield created a psychological layer that made his presence feel safe and his physical contact feel normal. On a film set, the director often uses physical touch to guide actors. A hand on a shoulder to adjust a mark, a pat on the back for a job well done. However, as the production moved from 2022 into 2023, the allegations suggest that Busfield's guidance became increasingly intimate and unnecessary. The boys were 7 and 8 years old when the behavior reportedly began, an age where the distinction between play and violation is entirely dependent on the guidance of the adults around them. The playful environment Busfield claimed to be fostering involved what the children initially described as tickling. It took place on their stomachs and their legs, often framed as a game or a way to keep the energy high during long, grueling shoots. But for the twins, the game didn't feel right. The affidavit details a growing sense of discomfort that the children couldn't quite articulate to the adults in the room. This is the central tragedy of on-set abuse. The victim is surrounded by people: producers, parents, crew members. Yet the power of the director is so absolute that the abuse happens in plain sight, disguised as creative energy. The boys felt the pressure of the production. They knew that Uncle Tim was the man who could make them stars or make them disappear from the script. In late 2024, the first formal alarm was raised. A pediatrician and a counselor at the University of New Mexico Hospital received information that prompted them to contact the authorities. This was the first time the legal system peered behind the curtain of the cleaning lady set. During this initial phase, the Albuquerque police conducted interviews with the boys and their parents. However, the tragedy of many child abuse cases is the disclosure gap. At that time, the boys were still immersed in the production. They were still under Busfield's direct authority. When asked if they had been touched inappropriately, they spoke of the tickling, but they did not yet have the words or the courage to describe the more invasive contact. They were protecting the playful world they had been told to believe in. Because the boys didn't describe specific sexual contact during those 2024 interviews, the case reached a legal stalemate. The police cannot arrest based on tickling alone, even if it feels off. For the next several months, the production continued. Busfield remained the executive producer. He remained the man in charge of the twins' daily lives. But the seeds of the truth had been planted. The mother of the twins began to notice changes in her sons. Anxiety, a reluctance to go to work, a shift in their behavior that didn't align with the excitement of being on a hit TV show. She began to ask questions, and the answers she received would eventually lead to a report that the studio could no longer ignore. The mother would later state that she reached out to Child Protective Services, CPS, as early as October 2024. She filed reports documenting her children's disclosures that there was abuse occurring from 2022 through the spring of 2024. According to her, she was met with a wall of bureaucracy. She was told that the behavior described did not rise to the level of abuse. It is a chilling detail in the timeline. A parent crying out for help, child actors showing signs of distress, and a legal system that required more before it would act against a Hollywood titan. This period of inaction allowed Busfield to maintain his status, but it also allowed the evidence to build as the children reached a breaking point. As the boys entered 2025, they were no longer the toddlers who had started the show. They were 11 years old. They were beginning to understand their own bodies and the boundaries that had been crossed. The Uncle Tim persona was no longer a comfort. It was a source of mounting dread. The affidavit suggests that the grooming process had moved through various stages, from the nickname to the tickling, to what would eventually be described as much more graphic and criminal contact. The power dynamic on the set was a pressure cooker, and in September 2025, the lid finally blew off. One of the twins, speaking to a counselor, finally broke the silence that had protected Timothy Busfield for 3 years. While the 2024 investigation had ended in a frustrating lack of evidence, the 2025 disclosure was different. It wasn't about play anymore. One of the boys sat in a quiet room and described a specific, horrifying violation that took place while the cameras were dark. It was a disclosure so graphic that the Albuquerque Police Department didn't just reopen the case. They prepared an arrest warrant that would send Busfield into a multi-day disappearance. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The 2025 disclosure was not a sudden outburst. It was a slow, painful crumbling of a wall of silence. In September 2025, one of the twin brothers, identified in court documents by his initials VL, sat down with a counselor and later a pediatrician. 4 years, the behavior on the set of The Cleaning Lady had been filed away under the label of play. But as the boys turned 11, the language of play was replaced by the language of trauma. VL described a specific incident that occurred while he was alone with Busfield in a bedroom on the set, a space that should have been a safe working environment. He alleged that Busfield didn't just tickle him. He touched and rubbed his genitals and bottom over his clothing. Most chillingly, the boy noted that afterward, Busfield appeared to be ashamed. It was a detail that added a layer of adult consciousness to the act, moving it definitively out of the realm of accidental contact. As this disclosure surfaced, the second twin provided a different but equally devastating perspective. He admitted to investigators that he, too, had been touched, but he had remained silent because he didn't want to get in trouble. In the world of a child actor, trouble is a multifaceted fear. It is the fear of ruining a multi-million-dollar production, the fear of disappointing their parents, and the fear of the director, the man who controlled their scene, their performance, and their future. This admission highlighted the success of the grooming process. It had created an environment where the victims felt responsible for the peace of the set. While one brother was vocalizing the physical violation, the other was exposing the psychological cage that had kept them both silent since they were 7 years old. The medical and psychological fallout described in the 12-page arrest affidavit provides a factual anchor for the severity of these claims. One of the boys was formally diagnosed with moderate post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and acute anxiety. A social worker documented that the child was plagued by recurring nightmares, specifically nightmares about the director touching him, from which he would wake up terrified. Other behavioral issues, including bedwetting and a sudden, sharp discomfort whenever Busfield was nearby, were noted by their mother. These weren't just bitter accusations. They were documented clinical symptoms of a child in deep psychological distress. Armed with this new evidence, Albuquerque Police Detective Marvin Kirk Brown moved to formalize the charges. On Friday, January 9, 2026, a judge signed a warrant for Timothy Busfield's arrest, charging him with 2 counts of criminal sexual contact of a minor and 1 count of child abuse. The legal machinery was now in motion, but when officers attempted to execute the warrant, they discovered a disturbing reality. The Emmy winner had vanished. For the next 3 days, the man who was a household name became a ghost. The search intensified rapidly, moving beyond the local Albuquerque police. The U.S. Marshals Service was officially called in to assist, focusing their search on New York, Los Angeles, and other cities where Busfield maintained residences or professional ties. The period between January 9th and January 13th was marked by a high-stakes game of digital and physical hide-and-seek. While the U.S. Marshals tracked his movements, the public narrative was being shaped in real time. Busfield's whereabouts were officially listed as unknown to the police, yet he was active behind the scenes. It was during this manhunt that the industry began to shudder. This wasn't just another Hollywood scandal. This was a fugitive situation involving a man who had been a staple of the screen for 40 years. The vacuum created by his disappearance was filled by a burgeoning digital archive of the case. As the 12-page affidavit began to leak to major news outlets, detailing not just the current charges, but the Uncle Tim persona that had allegedly facilitated the access. Then, on January 13th, the silence was broken, not by a police siren, but by a video uploaded to TMZ. In the footage, Busfield appeared in front of a window, with the Albuquerque skyline visible in the background, a clear signal that he was back in the jurisdiction. He looked weary but defiant. He claimed that he had only learned of the warrant on Friday night and had spent the weekend driving 2,000 miles across the country to confront these lies. He framed his disappearance not as a flight from justice, but as a journey toward it. "They're all lies," he told the camera. "I did not do anything to those little boys, and I'm going to fight it." It was a masterful piece of public relations, designed to humanize a man who was, at that very moment, a wanted fugitive. However, the legal reality of his voluntary return was more complex. Albuquerque police spokesperson Gilbert Gallegos clarified that the U.S. Marshals had been closing in on him in New York before he resurfaced. The video was released just hours before he walked into the Metropolitan Detention Center to be booked. While Busfield was portraying himself as a man driving through the heart of America to defend his honor, the prosecution saw it differently. In their subsequent filings, they argued that Busfield was prioritizing personal narrative control over the legal process. They pointed to the fact that he had ignored the gravity of the warrant for days, choosing instead to stage a media moment before surrendering to the handcuffs that were already waiting for him. As the cell door closed behind Timothy Busfield on January 13th, the narrative of Uncle Tim faced its first major interrogation. The defense was ready with a theory of revenge, but the prosecution was holding a much more dangerous card. They weren't just looking at the set of The Cleaning Lady. They were looking at a witness who claimed to have seen Busfield's behavior in a hair and makeup trailer, and a 30-year-old trail of similar accusations that suggested these boys weren't the first. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. When Timothy Busfield walked into the Bernalillo County Metropolitan Detention Center on January 13, 2026, he wasn't just bringing his legal team. He was bringing a specific story of betrayal. According to the 12-page arrest affidavit, Busfield's primary defense is rooted in the high-stakes casting politics of Hollywood. He told investigators that the allegations were a calculated effort by the twins' mother to destroy him. His claim that the mother was furious because her sons had not been brought back for the final season of The Cleaning Lady. Busfield alleged that lead actress Elodie Young had even warned him that the mother wanted revenge. This bitter parent narrative is a common defense in the industry, designed to paint the accusers as financially motivated or emotionally unstable. His attorney, Stanton Larry Stein, leaned heavily into this, pointing out that an independent investigation by Warner Brothers had previously found no corroborating evidence of wrongdoing. But as the case progressed into the courtroom on Wednesday, January 14th, the prosecution began to dismantle the revenge theory with a piece of evidence that had been quietly documented by the studio itself: a report from a witness in the hair and makeup trailer. According to the criminal complaint, While Warner Brothers officially stated they couldn't corroborate sexual abuse, their internal files contained a troubling report from December 2024. A witness, someone working behind the scenes, claimed they saw Busfield enter the hair and makeup trailer while a minor male was getting a haircut. The witness alleged that Busfield didn't just greet the boy. He leaned in and kissed him on the face. This incident, while separate from the primary charges, served as a behavioral anchor for the prosecution. It suggested that Busfield's boundary crossing wasn't limited to a single playful moment on set, but was a visible part of his daily interactions with children. The prosecution argued that the Warner Brothers investigation was fundamentally flawed because the studio's investigator failed to speak to key witnesses who had seen these red flags. This claim of corporate negligence adds a layer of systemic failure to the case. If the studio knew about the trailer incident in late 2024, why was Busfield allowed to continue his work as an executive producer and director, in a position of authority over the same children? For the victim's family, the revenge defense felt like gaslighting, a way to punish them for finally speaking up about a situation that the studio had supposedly investigated and cleared. The legal tension reached a fever pitch during Busfield's first court appearance on Wednesday. Appearing via video link in orange prison scrubs, the Emmy winner stood silent as prosecutors dropped a bombshell. They were seeking to hold him without bond. Their reasoning was based on what they described as a documented pattern of sexual misconduct, abuse of authority, and grooming behavior stretching back over 2 decades. They argued that Busfield's status and influence made him uniquely dangerous, as he could use his godlike director status to silence other witnesses who were already expressing fear of professional retaliation. To counter this, Busfield's defense revealed that the actor had voluntarily submitted to a private polygraph test just days before his surrender. According to Stein, Busfield passed with no deception. While polygraph results are rarely admissible as evidence in a criminal trial, the move was clearly intended to win the war in the court of public opinion. It was a play for narrative control, a way to tell the world that the man who played a judge on Law and Order SVU was being framed by a system he understood better than anyone. But the prosecution had more than just the current twins' testimony. They were beginning to weave together a history of accusations that the defense wanted desperately to keep out of the room. The revenge narrative also faced a logical hurdle: the timeline. The boys' parents didn't go to the police only after being fired. They had taken their sons to the University of New Mexico Hospital in November 2024, months before the final casting decisions were made, after the boys' behavior became so concerning that a medical intervention was necessary. The clinical diagnosis of PTSD and anxiety in the children predated the revenge motive Busfield claimed. For a jury, the question will be, why would a parent fabricate a multi-year trail of medical records and psychological trauma over a supporting role on a TV show? As the judge weighed the motion to keep Busfield behind bars, a new name surfaced in the legal filings. A 16-year-old girl from a different production. 14, her father claimed that when he confronted Busfield about inappropriate behavior, the actor didn't deny it. Instead, he reportedly begged the family to let him go to therapy rather than the police. The Uncle Tim persona was shattering, and as the trial approached, the focus shifted to the one person who knew him best: his wife, Melissa Gilbert. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the legal proceedings in Albuquerque shifted from the initial arrest to the pretrial phase, the focus moved beyond the walls of the Cleaning Lady production. For the prosecution, the case wasn't just about what happened between 2022 and 2025. It was about demonstrating a signature of behavior that they believed defined Timothy Busfield's 40-year career. To do this, they turned to the legal principle of prior bad acts. While a defendant is generally tried only for the crimes currently charged, many jurisdictions, including New Mexico, allow evidence of past incidents if they show a common scheme, a motive, or a lack of mistake. In the case of Timothy Busfield, the prosecution argued that his history was a roadmap of exactly how he allegedly operated. The most prominent ghost in the room was the 1994 allegation involving a 17-year-old on the set of Little Big League. In that case, Busfield hadn't just been accused. He had engaged in a high-stakes legal counteroffensive that mirrored his current strategy. He had sued the law firm representing the teenager for defamation, claiming the accusations were a shakedown. However, the result of that lawsuit remains a factual anchor in his history. He lost. A court ordered Busfield to pay approximately $150,000 to the law firm he sued. While the civil case with the teenager was eventually settled and kept confidential, the public record of his failed defamation suit suggested a pattern of using litigation to silence accusers, a pattern the prosecution argued was repeating itself with the revenge defense against the twins' mother. Then there was the 2012 incident. A woman had come forward in Los Angeles claiming that Busfield had groped her inside a movie theater. While the Los Angeles district attorney ultimately declined to file formal criminal charges, citing a lack of corroborating evidence, the incident remained on file. To a prosecutor, these weren't isolated misunderstandings. They were a series of data points. They all involved allegations of non-consensual touching in environments where Busfield felt he had anonymity or authority. When placed alongside the current charges of criminal sexual contact of a minor, these past claims served to dismantle the image of the playful director. They suggested that the Uncle Tim persona was a curated mask, one that had been slipping for decades. As these details resurfaced, the industry's reaction was total and immediate. The decision by NBC to pull the Law and Order SVU episode Corrosive was more than a scheduling change. It was a total rejection by the very community that had nurtured his career. For an actor who specialized in playing men of integrity, judges, high-level aides, and coaches, there was a profound, dark irony in the fact that he was set to play a judge in an episode scheduled to air just days after he was booked into a detention center. Warner Brothers Television, while defending their independent investigation's lack of corroboration, released a statement emphasizing that the safety of minors was their top priority. They didn't defend Busfield. They defended their protocols, effectively leaving the actor to stand on his own. The silence from the center of Busfield's world was equally telling. His wife, Melissa Gilbert, a woman whose life has been lived in the public eye as a symbol of Little House wholesome values, took the extraordinary step of deleting her digital presence. This wasn't just about avoiding hate mail. It was a strategic withdrawal. Through a representative, she made it clear that she was honoring the request of her husband's lawyers to remain silent. However, she also issued a warning about AI-generated deep fakes that were circulating online, purporting to show her speaking out against him. It was a 21st century complication to a classic Hollywood tragedy: the use of technology to create false narratives in the middle of a real-world legal crisis. Inside the courtroom, the human cost of the case became the focal point. The twins, now 11 years old, were no longer the silent faces on a TV screen. They were individuals who had spent years in a cycle of grooming and fear. The medical records presented in court documented the reality of their trauma, the nightmares, the anxiety, and the psychological scarring that no independent studio investigation could erase. The prosecution highlighted that the Uncle Tim nickname was a weapon, one that made the boys feel like they were betraying a family member if they spoke up. The courage required for an 11-year-old to stand up against a multimillionaire executive producer cannot be overstated. It was their voices, not the media reports or the studio files, that formed the heart of the criminal case. The trial of Timothy Busfield represents a landmark moment for the entertainment industry. It is a reckoning for the director's chair and the culture of playfulness that has long been used to mask boundary violations on set. For decades, the hierarchy of a film set provided a shield for those in power. If the director wanted to tickle a child, it was seen as character building. If a director wanted to be called uncle, it was creating a family atmosphere. This case has pulled the curtain back on those justifications. It has shown that protocols and independent investigations are often insufficient when the person being investigated is the person in charge of the production. As the case moves toward a verdict, the legacy of Timothy Busfield is already written. He will no longer be remembered solely as the man from the West Wing or Field of Dreams. He is now the man at the center of a 12-page affidavit that details the alleged grooming and abuse of 2 vulnerable children. The case in Albuquerque will decide his physical freedom, but the court of public opinion has already delivered a devastating judgment on the Uncle Tim persona. The final scene of this story won't take place on a soundstage. It will take place in a New Mexico courtroom, where the only cameras allowed are those documenting the consequences of a lifetime of alleged abuse. The story ends here, but for the survivors, the journey toward healing is just beginning. They have successfully moved the conversation from lies and revenge to a documented clinical reality. In doing so, they have ensured that the next time a child actor is asked to call a director uncle, the world will be watching much more closely. The playful environment is over. The reckoning has arrived. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.